Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Christopher Petrovich. Christopher, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. I'm glad to join everybody today. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay. So the topic is Amish theology. And I'm hoping to bring this together through the subjects of logic and tradition. Now, if you hear a little bit of background noise today, that's my son. He came to the phone with me. My second daughter has a temperature and has to go to town, so he'll be here. So if he makes any noise, just ignore that. Anyhow, I published or have coming out 4 publications, journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles that are broadly speaking related to Amish theology. Now, the first one I might mention would be Mennonite Quarterly Review, published back in July on interpreting scripture, reading, interpreting, and applying Christian scripture in Amish communities. The main thesis is that the Amish do not read the Bible as evangelical Protestants do, as is most common and typical today. And what typically happens among evangelical Protestants is that there is a search for principles. These are concepts that can be applied in all cultures, in all historical circumstances, and that can be extracted from the text and carried over and applied in any other context. Tailfill, nay, me did I. And this search for these principles actually goes back to transition in philosophy in the modern era. In the modern era, there was a growing recognition of a variety of cultures and of peoples. And if Christ is relevant to all peoples and cultures through all time, then we should be able to find in the scripture some teaching which transcends all of those cultures and that can be applied and reapplied in varying contexts. And this transition in philosophy, which actually begins with anthropology, the study of people groups, this growing recognition from the study of anthropology trickles down through the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and it reaches biblical interpreters so that they search for these biblical principles that can be applied in all contexts that anthropologists come along. So an anthropologist comes to each of these different places and people groups, and they are looking to apply Christ to their life, and they want to carry with them these principles. But in fact, this is not historically how scripture is used, and the Amish do not use it that way. So for my own creative theological work, I do intend to carry this thesis forward. Now, a second article titled Amish Ecclesiology, Plural Elder Congregationalism, Governing Lines of Fellowship, and Envisioning the Church, is basically kind of an introduction to ecclesiology, which is the doctrine of the church as it is practiced among the Amish, and being a little bit theological about this subject. So when we take the first part, Tailfill, may did I? When we take the first part, plural elder, it means that the congregation has multiple elders. It's not a single pastor model. And it's congregationalist because decisions are made at the congregational level rather than at the conference level, as you might have among conservative Mennonites. And then the second portion is governing lines of fellowship. So there is a certain amount of governance that happens among the Amish, you have varying groups. You have Schwartzentruber groups, you have the Stutzman Troyer, you have the Andy Weaver, you have the mainstream, what we might call South churches in Holmes County, Ohio. And then you have New Order and New Order. You have these different groups, for example, Kenton, and they each define their lines of fellowship differently. And that is a really, to me, is a fascinating question, because when we define our lines of fellowship, we're stating what's important to us. And not only what's important to us, but how do we relate to one another? And this brings us to the question of envisioning the church, so that when we make decisions on who we fellowship and why we fellowship with them, we are also reflecting the concept of what we expect of the church, how we envision the church. So how we make these decisions of what is important and what is maybe something that we can cooperate with others without breaking fellowship. We're making value judgments there. These value judgments, are a strong reflection of what is most important to us and what we find scripturally relevant. Tail Phil. So the third article is a JPAS article that's was going to be released last autumn, but will actually be released this spring. And it's titled The 1955 Diener Beschluss, Text, Interpretation, Reception History, and Historiography. So I'm taking a very close look, a very close analysis of the 1955 Diener Beschluss, and what that was a decision, a ministerial decision in Holmes County, Ohio, that split the Amish in two. And what it did is it divided the strict shunning from the mainstream. And then the congregations, they were locally known as the Andy Weaver churches because of the name of the young bishop who rallied the strict shunning people rallied around him. They took the position that they will fellowship with anybody who recognizes the 1955 Diener Beschluss and who does not fellowship with anybody who does not recognize it, which is a very important distinction. And the question for me, as I was planning to move into one of the Andy Weaver churches before I moved to Serbia about 9.5 years ago, was the question, actually, what does this document mean? If you read it, it's 3 articles long and it's very short. So in this article, I go into a very, in-depth study of the text itself in 3 different versions that we find it being published today. I asked the question of interpretation because there's really not much being stated. I mean, when you read it, you really don't at the surface find much that's being stated, that's being declared. So that requires a tremendous amount of interpretation. And what it does is it requires a knowledge of the statements of faith that preceded it, or the ministerial decisions. Diener Beschluss, Diener means minister and Beschluss means agreement. So the agreements that were made by the preceding meetings of church leaders. In order to understand what was being restated in 1955, we have to understand what came before. And I think, and my conclusion in this article is actually that there were different understandings of what was decided before, because there were different meetings that people were not always conscious of. And so there were a lot of Holmes County ministers who actually were aware of some decisions that were made in the past that others who came to the meeting were not conscious of. And as a result, they walked away from the meeting with different understandings of what previous church decisions, especially in 1917 and 1913, meant, let alone 1865, which was when the Old Order Amish became distinctively understood as Old Order. And the third part of the subtitle is reception history. So I track a little bit how the document was received and questions of historiography. So how does this give us a different take on the Amish? And that question of historiography, the Amish have now been essentially divided in two in the middle of the 20th century. And if you read standard histories of the Amish, you don't really so easily catch that the Amish world basically split in half in 1955. Now you do have some conservative if I may say, outlying groups, the Nebraska Amish, the Byler Amish, the Schwarzentrubers, and the Stutzman Troyers, who had already broken off and were separate. You have some of these smaller conservative factions that existed outside of this orbit, but this was otherwise a basic, almost complete division. And if you really look at that, if you look at this in depth, you can see a theological aspect. So each of these three articles contributes to my fourth article, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Religion, published by the University of Chicago, titled Writing an Amish Theology. And so what that does is I'm addressing the question whether it's possible to even write an Amish theology. And if I may say, in my own particular context, if you actually, if we can go back to the context in which I was first thinking of writing this article, I was living in Old Order Amish community in Perrysburg, Virginia, and the question was raised: why is Christopher interested in theology? And some people, some brothers in the church thought this was problematic, and one in particular who moved to Maine was writing me letters, sharing concerns about this. And if you go to the word theology, it's from two Greek words, theos and logos. Theos meaning God and logos meaning word or truth. In John chapter 1, where it says, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. Well, that word is logos, So this is really the study of the truth about God. So I think I was taken back or surprised why my friend, a very good friend, would find this objectionable. And then if you, the other important contributing factor here was an article written some years earlier by a Mennonite scholar who questioned whether there was even an Amish theology, whether it's even possible to write down an Amish theology, whether such even exists. So I felt that I felt myself a little bit up against the wall, and that I had something to prove. Now, my starting point is actually the first article in the first issue of the International Journal of Systematic Theology, where the editor asked the question, was there a theology from the beginning? Since the time of Christ, was there a theology? And he basically comes down and says, well, at least systematic theology is somewhat of a modernist construct. It's because we're really thinking and reflecting on these issues. We're really giving them a lot of thought in some very critical and detailed way. And it's basically a second order reflection on something of first order importance. So we might say, here we have scripture, and that's something, first order study. We can receive this communication directly from God. Now, when we do theology, we're actually going a step back, and we're actually reflecting on, when we're doing theology, we're not just asking scripture to transform us. Now we're reflecting on how scripture is transforming us, what we're learning. And it's a second order discipline because it's reflexive. When we come to scripture, we are anticipating, we're hoping for a direct message from God and something that will directly impact us in our soul. And theology is in some sense distinguishable, because then we come and we reflect on that action which is happening. And so the question is, do the Amish practice theology? And I would say that any Christian community is theological, inescapably so. I mean, we simply can't get away from that fact that we are theological if we are believing and teaching about God, and we're finding creative ways to put that into action. We're certainly being at least a certain amount reflective in that action. Now, I grew up in a evangelical Protestant setting, and I was also challenged from that vantage point as well, from Protestants who said, why am I leaving, a thoughtful and informed Protestant evangelical heritage for these uneducated peasants, these Anabaptists who don't really know basically what they're doing, and they're just uneducated people. Look, they go to 8th grade. Well, to be honest, I looked around a little bit more when I was still a youth, and I came to the conclusion that a lot of the pastors were very well educated. They were very conscious of what they were doing and what they were teaching and of the scriptures. But if you look at the average member, I'm not really convinced that there's a big difference between those two settings. So the burden in this paper is, my goal is, Journal of Religion is published by University of Chicago, and they're, mainstream religious, they have the divinity school there at the University of Chicago. And so they're very well known. They're very mainstream Protestant. So my goal here is to say, hey, we, in some sense, we stand on equal footing. What we're doing, we're not in competition or anything. We're not trying to prove anybody wrong. I'm simply trying to say, hey, we're really trying to do the same thing in the sense of theology as a second order reflective discipline. At least my goal is to try to put this on paper when we step back and look at this, if we may, a little bit more reflectively. So if we start with the Mennonite Quarterly Review article, and we say, hey, here in our handling of scripture, maybe we're not so conscious about this, but the fact of the matter is that when we apply scripture to our life, how are we harvesting the message? How are we finding the message in there? And are there any any overlaid grids, forms of interpretation that are altering our perspective? And I would say that there definitely are. I have also an article which is not mentioned here, but which was published in the Westminster Theological Journal. It's on 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 16 on head covering and on hair. And in that article, I argue that if a person follows the typical evangelical Protestant interpretation of scripture, which would be known as historical grammatical interpretation of scripture, they would reach a conclusion that a woman's long hair is her glory, and that it should be covered by a head covering, and certainly at the very least, when praying or prophesying, at least when in the assembly. I also argue beyond that it is something to be used every day, and nevertheless, what I want to get to here is that when a lot of modern commentaries come at this question, is this actually a head covering, to be used? Is this some practical teaching? So many of the commentaries will come and they will say, no, this is just actually about shame and honor. Back in the city of Corinth, there were a lot of prostitutes, so they were causing a lot of shame. And God is saying to the Corinthian women, you shouldn't be shaming us. So you shouldn't be going with uncovered head like the prostitutes had. Now, whether prostitutes had uncovered head or not is beside the point. But what they're doing is that they're pulling away and saying, this is not actually about the head covering, it's actually about shame and honor. And the reason that they come at that is because they come with an interpretive grid where they find a conclusion, a literal conclusion about wearing some sort of covering on the head, just unacceptable. Sorry, Theophilus came to the phone with me, and we also have a wood stove here, and so he was getting himself some ashes on his clothes. But anyhow, what type of interpretive grid do we bring to this reading of the scripture? And I find it a little bit refreshing that we can come to it. I'm not saying that the Amish or other plain Anabaptist groups don't bring other grids to it, but I feel a little bit refreshed that we do not need to subject it to alternative grids. So here, to bring this all together and the two thoughts of logic and tradition, a question is, to what extent do the Amish apply logic or use logic in their reasoning, in their church life, in their daily lives? And I think it's fairly well established that, at least in business, that we seem to be pretty conscious what we're doing, pretty thoughtful in what we're doing to try to succeed in what our goals are. And the question of tradition plays into this in a big way, because the question is, how do these two relate? How do we use the tools of logic and continue to embrace tradition? Where do these meet, and how do these interact with each other, and what is valuable in the tradition that we have? And I think that the South churches, or the mainstream Amish, in a lot of areas, they've reached a conclusion that if we drive a horse and buggy, if we speak German, and if we have, the traditional form of dress, that we have met the main qualifications. There is oftentimes that sort of perception that I receive. Now, if you would go, for example, to Orange County, Indiana, they are a 1950s offshoot of Northern Indiana, very, very conservative. In a lot of ways, they would look like Schwarzentroopers, but they don't have tobacco. They don't have bed courtship. They don't have social security numbers. They don't have bank accounts. They don't receive the budget. They're, as I understand, when they go to Walmart, if they would go to Walmart and they buy something, they don't want it to be the barcode to be scanned. And there's a lot of, a number of things that do make them unique. They have a completely different take on tradition. What is worth keeping, and what is important and relevant today? And if you would visit them, you would also learn that if there's a say a barn raising in the neighboring Schwarzentrooper community, they would be glad to go over and help, but as soon as any tobacco might come out, they would go home right away. So the Orange County people, I would say, really don't lack anything in terms of logic. They are thinking through those issues. They're mulling over those issues that they're discussing, and I think from my experience, I was in church there once, and I've exchanged letters, that they're conscious of what they're doing, and they can explain to me why they're doing it. So I would say that there's no contradiction between logic and tradition there. I would say it's a very complex relationship, and the question of how much we value tradition and what traditions we value are very unique questions. The Schwarzentroopers are currently what they call the Joe group, the largest group, subsect of the Schwarzentroopers is currently dividing. The door is open right now for families to go elsewhere if they want to. It kind of started in Etheridge, Tennessee, but anyhow, there are some that are going. A lot of families, no bishops that I know of, but they are going to different places. And the main issues are tobacco and bed courtship. And I think that there's a lot of thought going in these days among different groups of how they want to relate to questions, and especially relating to the young folks. I really don't think that at the end of the day that logic and tradition stand against each other. And I think Orange County would be an example, and I think this Schwarzentrooper division would be an example. And the people who are staying, there's one interesting place where you can find a little bit of insight on the way that some really conservative Amish think, and that is in these SMV triangle cases. There are some letters that are being brought by people, and also about the septic systems. Some people are, they'll write a brief to the court in their own hand, and they'll explain themselves. And you can get a little bit insight there. And you will find sometimes that they do make a statement. Please don't force us to put an orange triangle because we might not make it to heaven. Would you feel okay, basically excluding us from heaven by forcing us to do something contrary to our religion? And that's rooted in the belief that if we don't stay by the religion of our parents, then we will not go to heaven. And that is a theological statement. Whether, it's highly traditionalist in a sense, but it's also a thoroughly theological statement. So I think whether or not anybody will agree with me on any of my own convictions in my life and practices of us as a family, I think that the conclusion is, I think, well substantiated, that the Amish do have a theology, that they are reflective, and most of, I would say, this, tendency in some areas to say, hey, the Amish don't have a theology, is rooted in a misunderstanding of what theology is. And it comes, I think, from David Brousseau's book, something like Real Theologians, Please Sit Down, something like this. And it's based in the conception that what we do in church is not theology, and what these professors in ivory towers do is theology. And I think that that's just a mistaken view to say that we're not thinking about God, when we're in church. I think that that's just and that we can do that reflexively here as well, right in the churchyard as much as we can in an ivory tower, or in the University of Chicago, for example. So anyhow, that's enough for me. I'm looking forward to the questions that anybody might have, and I'll be glad to answer to the best of my ability.